DevelopSec, Developing Security Awareness with James Jardine, brought to you by Jardine Software. Hey everyone, welcome to the DevelopSec podcast. I'm your host, James Jardine, and I thought today we would revisit a topic, and I get this a lot because some of the tests I'm doing, I'm seeing it more and more, even though we don't see as much of it. We are seeing it as we're doing some of these testing, especially of older apps, of open redirect or unvalidated redirection and forwards, as typically listed in OWASP. And this is an important issue that we need to think about because the attack vectors we have with it are important. So we talked about this back in episode 35, which was back on December 15th of 2015. So it's been a while, almost 2 years since we've talked about this. So I wanted to bring it up again as we start to see it in assessments, as we start to talk about it during trainings. Currently doing training with a QA group right now. We're talking about open redirects. And it's interesting because we show demos of what we can do with an open redirect, and it really makes it understandable of, hey, this is how bad this could be. And what I really like about the way it can be presented is it's not just information for the developer. It's not just information for a tester going in to find this, or a pen tester that's going in and learning how to do pen testing and finding these type of flaws. But this is information that you can take back and use in your personal life. You can use it in your everyday computer usage when you're receiving emails of what you're looking for. Because a lot of times, especially in a lot of our examples, open redirects are taken advantage of through social engineering, where I'm going to send you an email to get you to do something that you may not realize you're doing. So the information works everywhere. It's not just this is what I do when I'm doing development, or this is what I do when I'm testing, but it's helpful for when you understand how some of these attack vectors work, you're more open to the idea of them, that hopefully you won't fall prey to them if they come into your inbox or some other method. So real quick review of what open redirects are. It's really the ability to control the URL that is typically on a parameter. So I'm not giving you a direct URL to go to. I'm not going to send you an email and say, hey, go to developsec.com. I'm going to send you an email in this type of a scenario to where I'm going to place a parameter of a URL someplace on a different. So maybe I'm going to send you to jardinesoftware.com with a URL of developsec.com. Now, it doesn't have to be sent via email, but the idea is that we're going to take a parameter from our application that is a URL, and we're going to redirect our page to that parameter without validating that the parameter is within our actual application. So basically, we're going from a local link or relative URL to an absolute URL. So I'm going to think I'm on jardinesoftware.com, and it then redirects me to developsec.com. Right? And there's lots of different techniques of why we may be redirecting. You see lots of news applications that do that type of thing, where they're going to redirect you out to another story. So maybe they have links to a bunch of stories, and they're going to help you redirect over to another location to be able to get to those stories. One of the most common places we see the open redirect flaw is on the authentication system. When you log in, because as developers, we try to be helpful. If you try to go to a page that requires authentication and you're not authenticated, then we're going to send you to the login page, and then we're going to track that URL you originally wanted to go to. And then when you log in, we'll redirect you to that URL. So that way you don't have to go find that page you were looking for. Very user-friendly in that sense. So a lot of systems you'll see like a return URL on the login page or some other URL up there. But keep in mind, this can happen anywhere where we're allowing setting URLs. This could be for things like external links that you allow people to set within their profiles. All kinds of reasons why we can have a URL as a parameter to our current page that we're going to then do a redirection to that may include redirecting us out to another site. So I mentioned relative versus absolute. When we talk about relative URLs, they keep us within our application, typically the slash and then some parameter or some link. So maybe slash add users.aspx. That's relative, starts with the slash, and it's going to keep us on the same domain that we originally were on. Now, when we talk about absolute URL, that's one that's going to start with the HTTP or 2 slashes, right? The whack whack, which identifies and says, look, I want to break out of the relative and I want to go basically right to this domain. So if I do a // DevelopSec.com, that'll actually take me to DevelopSec.com. If I did a /DevelopSec.com with just one, no HTTP or anything, just /DevelopSec.com, it'll try to take me to, say I'm on JardineSoftware.com, JardineSoftware.com /DevelopSec.com, right? And then of course it's going to come up with a page not found and it doesn't work, right? Because that relative URL gets appended to our current domain. Absolute URL ignores the current domain and tries to go to that original domain that you're trying to actually get to. So in this case, / DevelopSec.com will take me to DevelopSec.com, not a section of JardineSoftware.com. So it's a pretty simple flaw, and it's usually pretty simple to look for because we're looking for URLs as parameters. And there's lots of things we look for when we see URLs as parameters. This is just one of them. So we want to take that and find it. Okay, we see that there's a URL as a parameter. Now we need to understand how that URL is being used from a client-side redirection to see how we can help make sure that we're not vulnerable to an open redirect. So again, I mentioned things that indicate an absolute URL are when the URL starts with HTTP or HTTPS, or if it starts with just the /, indicating that's absolute. We're going to drop out of the current domain and we'll go to whatever's after that /. A lot of people make the mistake, they just try to look for URLs that start with HTTP and then they miss that case of the /, and then we're still vulnerable. So we want to make sure that we're not missing that case, that we're testing for all of those. And sometimes it can be tricky. And so what we really want to do is a lot of frameworks have the ability to have a function that says, like, is this a local URL or is it not? Or is it absolute versus relative? So check your documentation and see, like I know .NET has functions available where you can just pass it and say, hey, is this local? Other applications or frameworks may have those same type of methods. So if they do, use those. If they don't, build one that's going to work that you can use across your applications and then do a lot of testing on it to make sure that it is validating exactly how you want it to validate, that it always returns is local for only local and false for is local if it's absolute. And there's lots of cases around this. So we just got to make sure that we're really tight on making sure that we test this very well, because it's easy to miss a simple little thing. And I'll give you a quick example. It was years ago, this isn't the case anymore, where with .NET, you could actually bypass and get it to think that it was a local URL by appending the / at the end of your URL, of that parameter URL that you were passing in. And when that got parsed, it treated it as a local, but it would actually let you redirect outside the current domain. So simple little things like that can help slip by. So remember, we're looking for, when we see parameters that have URLs, we're looking at where that data is coming back down, and then we're going to try to manipulate that data and see if we can get the shift from relative to absolute. Can I get it to redirect me outside of my current domain? Redirecting inside the current domain usually is not an issue, right? We're within our same app. As an attacker, I can't control that app from that perspective. But I can control it if I can get them to go out and to go over to my domain, right? Some other site. So it's pretty simple when we're going to test it, but a lot of times we don't understand why it is that this is important, right? Okay, I can redirect you to another site. Maybe there's 100 ways I can get you to go to another site. Things we have to consider, though, is that when we're doing the redirection from a trusted site, people are more likely to fall into it, right? If I look at this as an example of a news site, and I'm going to do the redirection over to some malicious site, the users typically don't understand, or they're not paying attention because they're on a site they trust, that if I click that link, it's going to send me out someplace. Now, with a news site or some other sites, one of the things we'll see is we'll see a little pop-up that says, hey, we're about to redirect you to XYZ site. Do you want to continue? This is good for those type of things, right, where we know we're going to be passing you to external sites. So I just want to give the user a little warning that, hey, you're leaving our site. We typically don't do that on authentication pieces because we're expecting to be within the same site. But we may see that prompt come up. But remember, the user's trusting because I'm on a site I trust. I know I'm on Jardine Software, so I feel comfortable there. So if I click a link, I trust that it's a good link. So we trust that. If I switch over to phishing and I'm going to send an email out, right? I'm now sending an email with a valid link to a site that the people trust. The link really is going to take me to Jardine Software. It's just then going to redirect me once I'm there to that other site, right? But we're taking advantage, again, of that trust and the training we've taught people of here's what to look for when you get phishing emails. Hey, where is this going? Hover over the link. Don't click it. Make sure that, the actual value where the link is going to go is someplace that you trust. And when you look at the start of the URL, you're going to say, oh, yeah, I trust that. That's jardinesoftware.com. I'm good. I'm going to click that, right? And oftentimes we ignore all that back stuff because there's no trickery there. You are going to that trusted site to start with. So let's talk about a potential attack scenario. This is the one I like to use, especially when I find it on authentication pages, although it doesn't have to be on the authentication page itself. But think of the scenario where you go to a page, you're not authenticated, it redirects you to the login page, and puts the return URL up there of that initial page you're going to, addusers.aspx. Well, if I change that URL, right, I send you an email that has jardinesoftware.com/login.aspx return URL equals developsec.com/login.php, all right? Very simple. I'm going to send you that link. You're going to go to jardinesoftware.com. You're going to log in. You're going to log in successfully. But I've gone ahead and created a clone of that login page all the way down to the detail of what the page shows when your login is invalid. So if it pops a little message box that says, hey, invalid user password, whatever that message is, that's cloned on this page that I have sitting out there on developsec.com. So now you go to jardinesoftware.com, you log in. On successful login, it redirects you to developsec.com, but the page looks exactly like the jardinesoftware.com login screen. The only difference that you can notice is if you look in the URL, you'll notice that the URL is different. But how often when you mistype your password, and this happens, I do it 5 times a day at least. When I mistype my password, I just type it in again. And if the page looks the same, branding's the same, icons are the same, the error message is exactly the same, I'm not going back up and checking the URL to make sure that I'm actually still on that page. Everything looks the same, right? Our eyes are going to see it. Nothing looks different. I'm going to continue and I'm going to log in. Well, in this case, I log in. It actually takes those credentials, stores it on the developsec.com server, and then redirects me back over to the Jardine Software page, which I'm already authenticated to. And I feel like, oh, all right, I just mistyped my password. I'm in. I use the system as usual. And through all that, I've now lost my credentials. Somebody has stolen them. And I really have no idea because it's that seamless of what it looks like unless you're looking up at that URL. So lots of things that we can take away from this, right? One, how easy it is to do credential theft using an exploit around open redirect, especially on a login screen. But remember, that can be done anywhere. I mean, if I can store a URL for somebody to click later on, instead of just doing the login screen, I may do something where it indicates a session timeout and you need to relog in on that DevelopSec.com site after it redirected you from JardineSoftware.com, and then I'd redirect you back when you logged in. So credential theft is really a big thing here, a big possibility, because of how easy that can be. Because again, if the branding looks the same, I'm not going to check that. But as regular users, as we're looking at things, everybody's not going to be looking at all the parameters. If I receive an email, am I looking at, oh yeah, I'm going to JardineSoftware.com, am I going to look at all the parameters? Remember that by looking at the parameters, I could also encode those parameters in ways that would make it very difficult to read it. So it wouldn't be obvious that there's another domain sitting in there. And a lot of people wouldn't understand that anyway. But it does let me know that, hey, I am going to the site I'm expecting to go to. But now we're a little bit more aware of the idea that when I go log in, one, make sure I'm on the site I expect to be on, right? Look at the URL, not necessarily the branding, but let's look at the URL and look at it closely. And then if I mistype my password or it says that my password is invalid, rather than quickly going and retyping it, again, validate that you are on the page that you think you are on. Now keep in mind that in my tests, I use a domain that is very different from the domain that we're testing. So it is pretty obvious. If you were to look up, you'd know right away you're not on that page. But in a real world example, I would get a domain that would be very close to what yours is. So if a quick glance at the URL, it wouldn't be noticeable that that's not the page that you're on. So just keep that in mind, that this is why we're looking at these issues. And that's one of the things we have to figure out. It's not necessarily knowing every different way to be able to exploit a vulnerability, but understanding, why do we have a risk here? How does that risk affect us? And this could be different for everybody, depending on your organization, depending on the type of data you deal with, how secretive and sensitive are these accounts? How would this work if we were requiring things like two-factor authentication, right? There's lots of variables that go into this and manipulate and change how the risk changes based on those different things, right? This scenario would be very different if we were saying, hey, look, we're going to pop a second factor and now I got to put in a Google Authenticator code, or I got to put something like that. Maybe I can't get those, or maybe I can figure out a way to work those into the process. But at minimum, I may be still able to get your username and password, which may be a pretty good start, right? So that's what we need to consider. And that's why it's important as developers, when we're looking at things like, hey, we're going to take a URL and we're going to call location.href on it, or we're going to do some sort of redirect, that we're validating, we're redirecting within the constraints of our application, right? So we take a step back, we think about from a business analyst perspective, when we talk about requirements and design, this is where we're saying, hey, we've got a URL here, we want to be able to redirect back to this page, or we want to be able to do that. Okay, well, let's make sure that we're describing that this redirect should be relative only, or it allows absolute, but now we have a whitelist. Here's the places that we can redirect to. Or we've got a message that gets displayed, so we won't redirect the user without first displaying a message that says you're about to be redirected to a site external to our site. We can't be held responsible for anything that happens on that page, blah, blah, blah. Lots of things we can do there. But we want to consider that as part of our design. So that way, when we get to the developers, right, they understand, hey, what are we doing with this when we're going to redirect this? Are we going to pop a message? Are we going to limit where we can redirect to relative only? If we have certain paths that we want to allow redirection to, do we want to have a whitelist and compare to make sure that the path presented matches a path that we have? Right, checking all those things. And then once we get to QA and QC, and we start looking at this stuff, now again, we're saying, okay, we know we have this path that's being passed as a parameter. We're doing a redirection. Design And the requirements all say, hey, this redirection can only be relative. We don't want to allow absolute. So we know what we're testing for. Or maybe we have the requirements that say we're going to prompt a box. So our testing changes now to, hey, I want to make sure that when I put in an absolute URL, it prompts that box that I'm going outside the site. If I put in a relative, maybe it doesn't prompt that box, right? Understanding how the app is supposed to function, and then we can start testing for it in those test cases to make sure that it's functioning how we want it to function. So lots of interesting stuff around an open redirect. Now, again, we could take open redirect and we could, just redirect to a malicious site. Not necessarily trying to steal credentials. Maybe it's a malicious site that tries to install malware or ransomware or something like that. Those are all possible as well. I always like the stealing of the credentials because it's a good way to show this is what we can do with this, and it directly relates to the app and why it's important to our app, versus it's still important that, hey, somebody can put a redirect in and try to get ransomware on your system, right? That's still important, don't get me wrong. But we want to look at it from the perspective of how does this affect my app? What do I need to do with this? Because we need to protect this. But it's still important for us to understand how does this affect the end user, because we don't want our app being the reason, right? Because people trust our app, that somebody got redirected and got ransomware because we weren't doing the proper checking based on our requirements to say, hey, we shouldn't allow redirection without the user knowing they're going outside of our current app. So redirection is an interesting beast. And I encourage people to look at it, check it out, learn what you can about it, but just remember the basics of it, that it's basically just comes down to relative versus absolute pathing. How do we want to allow redirection? And in most cases, we don't want to allow absolute URLs. We only want relative URLs. We want to redirect within our app. And in those other cases where we want to allow redirection out, how do we want to handle that redirection? Do we want it to just work? Do we want to prompt a message? Do we want to whitelist? How do we want to handle that so our users know that something is about to happen that's out of the norm, or at least making us aware that we're leaving that site? So nice little, I think refresh on open redirects. Again, if you want to go back, I didn't listen to it beforehand, but you can listen to episode 35 from 2 years ago. Probably somewhat similar, but to be fair, I'm not sure. So, feel free to go back and listen to that one as well. And if you've got comments on open redirect or interesting ways you've seen it exploited or cool different attack scenarios, feel free to share them, send them in. Let us know. It's a great conversation to have, to talk about them. Because again, I don't think from a testing standpoint, I don't need to know every different way that I could exploit an end user. It breaks down to that basic of relative and absolute, and are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? Yes or no, right? And I don't need to be able to show 5 different ways to exploit it. We do that during pen tests, right? To be able to show what the real risk is. Here's what I can do with this. But when we're talking internal teams, it's look, I just want to show you we're allowing absolute URLs. That is a risk. We should not be allowing these. Let's go back. Let's look at the requirements. Let's talk to developers. Let's figure out what we should be doing to help mitigate this, to reduce the risk there. So thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll get the next episode up soon. But this is episode 85. Wow, we're getting up here. So interesting that we were 50 episodes ago that we talked about this. So it's good to rehash some of these different items. But again, questions or you have comments, reach out. It's james@developsec.com, or you can reach me at DevelopSec on Twitter or at Jardine Software on Twitter. Your choice. I monitor both. And again, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
You have been listening to the DevelopSec podcast with James Jardine. Follow us on Twitter at DevelopSec and visit our website at www.developsec.com for more episodes and information.